Welcome back to the studio, guys. You voted for which skull you wanted me to try casting. You guys picked the Fisher, which I do agree looks cooler, just more challenging. Now there's numerous things that make this challenging. One is the bone crest on the top of the head. This is where the muscles would attach to that link to the jaw that give it a very strong bite to break bones and crush everything up. But also, there's a lot of hollow spots. The nose here goes all the way through. It runs in there and out there. Also the inside of the brain cavity, I'll have to fill that in. These orbital bones here are very thin and they're very long. So what I might do is on the inside, I might build it up with clay. By building that up, I'll give the wax a little bit better chance of actually getting all the way through there. You can see how thin the bone is on the jaw. As much as I don't want to, I'm going to have to build the jaw up. Otherwise, I know wax just isn't going to get in there. So I took a little drywall mud and I used it just to bulk up those really thin sections a little bit. I want to blend it in well enough so you can't tell that I bulked up the inside of the jaw, and I figured maybe the drywall mud would give me a more seamless transition. I also put some on the inside of the orbital bones just to bulk it up a bit, and on the inside of the orbital, nobody's going to see it. It had a few cracks in it when it dried, so I took a damp cloth and some sandpaper to smooth it out. Once it's prepped, I'll make a clay bed that'll cradle the jaw for making the mold. I want a smooth and defined transition between the bone and the clay. The smoother I get that, the better the parting lines will be. Looking at how the jaw splays open at the top, I need to make sure I design the mold so I don't entrap the piece that I'm molding. So I build up the side of the mold to make sure the jaw isn't going to catch. I embed a small wax sprue, and that'll allow me to carve vents and get the air out of there so I don't end up with any bubbles in the wax. I trim the edges flat and get it ready for the box. I also try to make sure I add sprues to anywhere I think an air trap will happen. Put a larger sprue in that'll take the place of the feeder. I figure feeding it to the inside of the jaw will be the least invasive place. And I carve vents at each peak of the tooth. And for a box, I'm just going to hot glue some foam board in place. I try to close in all the gaps the best I can, and then it's ready for rubber. So while that's curing, we're going to start working on the skull. Now I'm going to use a thin plastic bag to shove inside the nasal cavity and the cranium. That'll keep the silicone rubber from going inside and locking everything in place when it cures. For these smaller holes, I'll just block them with a little bit of clay. And then I make a bed, just like we did for the jaw, to cradle the skull. So looking at the contours of this skull, there's some negative space that goes in. So if I put a block mold around this, it's going to latch on. I'm not going to be able to pull that out. I think I'm going to do instead is do a thinner skin mold. So I'll really be able to use the flexibility of the silicone to pull around any contours that might want to trap everything together. The holes right here are kind of an important feature of the skull, and I'd like to save those. So when I pour the mold, I'll come back and I'll plan on just cutting those when I demold it. And just like the jaw, I'll make sure I carve vents for each high point in the teeth. I'll use my ball stylus to make sure I press in keys so the top part will lock in place with the bottom. Then I'll separate it with a sheet of plastic. Now I got the idea for this style of mold from Smooth On. A guy on that channel molded a bear skull in a very similar way. I'm going to do what's called a cavity pour mold. So I take layers of clay and that builds space. I'll then pour a hard backer. I'll take the clay away later and that'll make the cavity. And then I fill it with silicone rubber. You'll see. I had to go back and add a platform, and that's going to be the separation point between the top and the bottom half of the mold. Then I cut some strips of clay to be used as keys for the hard backer I'm going to put on. This will make sure that the rubber locks into the hard backer perfectly every time. I'll add a few more keys and then I'll pour plaster over the clay. When the plaster's hardened and the silicone's locked in place, I know it'll be the right shape every time. Now while that sets, I'm going to go back to the other side of the jaw. On this step, all I need to do is remove the clay. Then I spray my mold release and it's ready to pour the other side. Sometimes there'll be stringers of silicone that I need to cut out because there was a little gap in between the clay. Does holding your breath count as a safety precaution? Once that's done, I just pour the other side. Alright, now while our silicone cures, I'll get back to this. I would rather only remove the plaster backer and the top portion of the clay, but it kind of got stuck together and I had to take the whole thing off the sheet of foam board that I had. I'll just be extra careful with it because we're not done with that part yet. This spacer was not supposed to come off. I need that back on there, so I'm going to carefully try to put it back where it was. So you see that void, we took all the clay out, and now when we pour the silicone rubber in there, that will become our mold. I make sure to seal the edge with clay so none of the silicone runs out. And then I slowly pour it in. So the jaw should be set. Let's break it open and see what we got. I use a small chisel to clear away any stringers that are left behind and to make sure that the gates are nice and clear. Where I carved a negative space into the clay, it leaves a positive space in the silicone rubber. So I just carve away that positive space and now I have a vent. Time to fill it with wax and see how it worked. Looks pretty dang good. So with that done, it's time to go back to this thing. It started to leak a little bit, so I tried to clamp it shut. I've seen people drill vent holes and pour it like this, and that might have been a better option, because when I went like this, the clay started to pull away and I had some leakage. But since the top was open, I figured that would work, and I think it did. Let's open it and see. I don't know how I screwed this up, but I didn't have the clay going all the way to the tip of the tooth. I'm really worried that's going to be an air bubble, so I took some Sprue Wax and connected a channel there. And once I pour the mold, I'll just make a slit to pull those out. So there'll be a vent in place, and I'll be able to retrieve the wax that fills that void each time. I'll add a plastic layer to separate it, and then bulk up the top part with clay. I'll add strips of clay to act as keys, just like we did on the top portion. So I arrange these keys in an upward motion because I'm going to do a vertical pour again, and hopefully any air bubbles will get up and out. I'll add a little Vaseline to act as mold release between the two plaster layers. Mold release is pretty much always a good call. A little trick to get plaster to cure a lot faster: add a little salt. It makes a huge difference. I'll use clay to seal the two sides and some clamps to hold it upright. I pour it in very slowly and give it time for the bubbles to come up to the surface. So I had to put a clamp on it because when I poured it in, it started wanting to separate. I guess I see why now people pour it this way and just put a plate on the back to hold everything in. I was really surprised at how strongly the plaster adhered to the rubber. Normally silicone rubber doesn't stick very well to things, but in this case, I had to break the plaster apart to get it off. So my plaster backer broke into a million pieces. I probably should have used something stronger like fiberglass, but that stuff stinks. But while this is all still solid, I'm going to make another backer, and I think I will use the fiberglass. It's more expensive, and it does stink a lot, but fiberglass is a much stronger option. A lot stronger than the plaster, but it does stink. Now hopefully this skull will come out fairly easy, but now's the test. I had to make cuts around some of the holes that I left open in the skull. And I also made a relief cut up to the skull crest so that could be removed freely. I should have put a little extra mold release on the drywall mud. I'll press the rubber back into place into the cap, and that'll keep it in a perfect shape for the skull. I glued some foam board fins on there so it'll be able to stand upright on its own. I'll pour the wax in, but I also want to make sure that the skull is hollow, so I'll pour it in and out to create layers. This is easily the best mold I've made to date. The jaw fits in perfectly, the texture of the skull is beautiful, and I think this is going to turn into a really cool bronze. We're going to leave it there, pick it back up on part 2. Come on back for that video. Thanks for watching.